Hello, and welcome to the sixth webinar in our PFAS remediation series, and thanks for joining us. My name is Dave Kirkby, and I'm the CEO of OPEC Systems. And with me, we've got Pete Murphy, our Managing Director.
Hey, everyone.
And Dave Burns, our Senior Scientist.
Hi.
Please feel free to add any questions you may have into the webinar platform in the chat box on the bottom right-hand corner. We'll try and get to those questions during the webinar or at the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. We're aiming for a 60-minute session today, including 10 minutes of questions at the end. We've had a really great response to our webinar with over 200 registrations across the 3 webinars from all facets of the PFAS remediation world. And if you'd like to have a look at the first 5 webinars, you can find those on our EPOC Enviro website. So a lot's happened in the last 2 years. So today we're going to provide you with a global update around what's been happening with SAFF. We're going to concentrate on concentrating, where we talk about the importance of concentration in the PFAS remediation train. We're going to talk about SAFF and short chains and developments in modes of removal of those short chains. Then we're going to talk about the US EPA announcement around maximum contaminant levels and what that means for the US water utilities. Lastly, we'll have a 10-minute Q&A. So let's get started. So Pete, for those people who are not familiar with the SAFF technology, can you give us a quick overview, please?
Yeah, mate, no worries. Hello, everyone. Bear with us. It's 5 in the morning over here, so we're just kind of coming to life. But so we've spoken a fair bit in previous webinars on how the SAFF process works, so I'll keep it short. But in essence, we rely on the physical removal of PFAS from water by using the air-water interface and the capacity of PFAS molecules because of the polar charge to adhere to that air-water interface, where they rise to the surface, and then we harvest those products, typically as a foam, but also as a frothy mix. And as we'll go into later, there's a few different techniques. But in principle, it's just the use of air bubbles to harvest PFAS is what foam fractionation is.
Thanks, Pete. So if you're unfamiliar with that technology and you'd like a bit more information, you can find that at our website, which is www.epocenviro.com. So Pete, OPEC Enviro's come out of the COVID years with, hit the ground running basically with a couple of really great initiatives. You'd like to tell us about those?
Yeah, mate, look, a really hectic couple of years, I'd have to say. I feel about 20 years older after 2 years of working on it, but it's been brilliant. We've had a lot of really important milestones passed. I'd say, one of the most interesting ones for me is that we just passed a billion litres. So for the US audience, about 265 million gallons of PFAS treated, of PFAS impacted waters treated across a whole range of 20 or 30 different types of water in a whole bunch of different locations, in different climatic conditions, in different lithologies, treating groundwaters, different types of leachate waters from industrial and domestic leachates, different types of event waters, and the list goes on and on. So just getting the learnings out of those huge volumes of water treated has been so educational for us to just improve and refine the process. So at the moment, we're treating about over 10 million gallons a month, and that's kind of rising by about 2 million gallons a month at the moment. So we're really on a bit of a ramp up. We've just put our 38th SAFF unit out into the wild. So the SAFF units are a 40-foot containerized PFAS water treatment plant that treat anywhere from about 100,000 to 250,000 gallons per day. So they're quite a high throughput system. We've celebrated a few key anniversaries. So it's been 5 years since we put our first water treatment plant at the Oakey site in Queensland, Australia. That system has been going like the proverbial steam train ever since. It's treated about 260 million litres, so about 70 million gallons of water, and it's reduced that down to about 20 gallons of hyper-concentrate. So 260 million gallons treated, to 20 million gallons of hyper-concentrate produced across
20 litres.
Sorry, 20 gallons,
gallons.
77 litres. So very tiny amount of fractionate produced across primary, secondary and tertiary stages of foam fractionation. So ours is a multi-stage fractionation process that results in these huge concentration factors. So at that site, we're getting about a 3.4 million times reduction in volume. So basically every 3.4 million gallons we put through, we get a gallon of concentrate. So that has been just a star performer for us. Similarly in Sweden, we celebrate our 3rd anniversary for the Telge site, which is Stockholm's biggest landfill out at Södertälje, just out of Stockholm. I put that system in early 2021 in the depths of a very, very cold winter. And so for an Aussie boy far from home, that was somewhat of a challenging working environment. But with the team from Envitec, our European distributors, we got that system up and running, and it's been charging ever since. The reduction, the concentration factors on leachate, as we'll sort of dive into a bit later, are a little lower, but that system is treating about 25 million gallons a year, getting up towards 30 million gallons, and it's resulting in about 4,000 gallons of concentrate a year. I'm doing the quick conversion from litres to gallons, so forgive me if I stall on that. But yeah, it's producing about 15 intermediate bulk containers, IBCs, a tote per year, which again is really not a lot of waste for it to handle. So that's been great. I think Dave's going to take us over a whole bunch of field trials that we've been through. I mean, just trial upon trial, just to prove the system in multiple applications that we'll tell you a bit about. And then we just lodged our 5th patent in January. So we've now lodged 5 patents, which have a total of getting up towards 200 different claims that sort of enshrine the process of foam fractionation. Some of the key ones that are coming through are the multi-stage foam fractionation. So fractionating the fractionate and then fractionating that again to get these great hyperconcentrates. The application of vacuum for foam extraction, the addition of amendments for short chain removal. So there's some really key features that are now getting enshrined in that body of patent knowledge. So it's good from our point of view commercially to see that journey ongoing. And yeah, I know I could go on, Dave, but they're probably some of the key highlights.
Thanks, Pete. So Dave, would like to talk to us about those lab scale and field trials the last couple of years?
Yeah, sure. So especially in the last 2 years, including a little bit, going back a little bit further, we've done over 50 lab scale trials using our custom desktop SAFF apparatus that we've actually shared them with our partners here in Australia. There's a couple in the US. We've also shared those with Envitec and some other people in Europe. And then like that extends from the lab into the field, where we've done over 20 field scale trials. And these things have allowed us to create excellent relationships with distributors like Envitec in Europe, Alonia in the US, and Crystal Clean also in the US, who's our wastewater specialist partner. So the types of waters that we've been involved with on these lab scale and field scale trials include groundwater, surface water, landfill leachate, industrial trade wastewater,
RO reject,
RO,
event water from firefighting.
It's just about everything. There's a couple of interesting ones that we're going to be jumping into shortly, especially raw sewage wastewater treatment.
Just to chat about that raw sewage for a sec, Dave. I mean, that's a project we've got coming up very shortly, where we're actually putting the SAFF system behind the primary screen in a sewage treatment plant, and we actually hold a lot of hope and prospect for that. SAFF's very robust. It can handle really high suspended solid loads in the influent stream. So what we're hoping is we're going to transition a lot of the PFAS mass out of the biosolids and into the aqueous phase, where we're going to then harvest that PFAS and remove it from the sewage water. So that is a fascinating project. I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah, and then there's like the next level or next tier of especially field scale trials, especially in the US. So CERTA, ESTCP, DIU. There's several of those that are currently operating where we're not so much demonstrating SAF's efficacy anymore. It's to demonstrate the compatibility with SAF with various destruction cell developers, which is quite important for us. We have 2 Horizon 2020 funded grants that have another 1 to 2 years to complete. And then there's our first research program here in Australia with the Australian Research Council, where we were evaluating foam fractionation and fluid fractionation in a liquefied soil with Macquarie Uni and the University of New South Wales, evaluating those 2 techniques individually and together in both ex situ and in situ applications.
Yeah, we've got a fair bit of work in that PFAS impacted soil wash water space happening in some of those trials at the moment. It's another good application where you've got a really high dissolved and suspended solid content, but of course, because of the nature of foam fractionation, it handles that really well.
The thing that rounds all this off, where we get to engage with stakeholders all over the world, is our recent affiliate membership with the ITRC, where we were, lucky enough to share our knowledge of what we've learned along the way in foam fractionation and bubble fractionation with others, and then have the ITRC recognise SAF as a proven field application water treatment technology.
Great organisation.
Thanks, Dave. So it's pretty certain that EPOC Enviro is making really decent inroads into the PFAS remediation space in Europe and the US and Australia. So great to hear. So I'd like to remind everybody, please, that you can add any questions you have into the chat box on the webinar platform, and we'll try and get to those questions throughout the webinar or at the Q&A at the end of the session. So now we're going to move on to concentrate on concentrating, where we talk about the importance of concentration in the PFAS remediation train. Pete, why is concentration so important?
Well, lots of reasons, I guess, mate. Is we've been hanging around the PFAS space now for about 8 years, and a lot of the media coverage, a lot of the interest has been on how do you destroy these complex molecules, that fluorine-carbon bond, strongest bond in nature. How do you defluorinate it? How do you mineralize it? How do you actually get rid of it? And I think those are really important discussions, and some amazing technologies have evolved out of that destruction space. But several years ago, the ITRC in particular realised that there's multiple phases to solving the PFAS problem, and the steps of separating it out from these water bodies and then concentrating it down to a manageable volume and then destroying it is the entirety of the process. And then transport is another element that we put in there as well in some presentations. But the separation is now being done quite effectively across a number of different techniques, and obviously we favour foam fractionation, but there's others out there. It works extremely efficiently to separate PFAS from water. And you've got to remember, there are countless trillions of gallons of PFAS impacted water now out in the world across tens, if not hundreds of thousands of PFAS impacted sites. And so there's no single destruction technology that you're just going to pour all this water into and get it sorted, get the PFAS destroyed. You've got to take that water, you've got to put it through a process, you've got to take that waste content with the PFAS in it, hyper-concentrate it, and then hand it over to destruction cells. So we've put a lot of effort into the concentration side of it. We've really been doing multi-stage fractionation since you first began back in 2016, and you were figuring out how to get rid of the water.
Yeah, well, as a side note, it was interesting how we stumbled over this. Back in January 2016, where we were doing the desktop studies, we generated a lot of primary fractionation waste in bottles lining up the shelves in the back of the lab, and we looked at it and we were running out of shelf space. So that's when the idea dropped, let's throw all those back through the fractionation process.
Yeah.
And that's where multi-stage fractionation began for us.
So now we have that primary, secondary and tertiary stage, and as we'll see in some of the later presentations, getting those volumes down, we think, is a critical part of solving the PFAS puzzle.
Nice, thanks, Pete. That answer leads us very nicely to we're about to show you a short video that introduces for the very first time our SAFF Hyper-Concentrator.
Here it is, the SAFF Hyper-Concentrator, EPOC Enviro's latest technology to be released into the marketplace. Our first system has just hit North America, and we wanted to take a little bit of time to tell you what we've got. The SAFF 40 systems are a multi-stage foam fractionation system. We've been developing now for the last 8 years, and they conduct primary fractionation, secondary fractionation, and tertiary fractionation. One of the challenges that we've discovered in more complex waters, like leachates in particular, and complex industrial wastewaters and event waters from firefighting events and the like, is that the concentration factors, the ability to convert large volumes to smaller volumes of waste, are not as high for these complex waters. So where we might expect concentration factors at tertiary of up to 1 million times in the traditional groundwater or surface water applications, in these complex waters, we're getting more in the thousands, tens of thousands of times concentration steps. Great, but unfortunately what happens is by the time we get to tertiary fractionation, we've got so much secondary concentrate, we actually slow the throughput of the system down. So we've had to have a bit of a rethink about how we manage this tertiary fractionation process. The SAFF 40s have it inbuilt, and they always will, you can still utilise that process. But to maximise throughput and to add the most value, the Hyper-Concentrator handshakes to the SAFF 40, accepts its secondary waste, and then processes it into tertiary waste. We've been lucky enough to be able to take all of the engineering design lessons and the safety lessons and the processing lessons of these last 8 years, and then build them into this great new product, the Hyper-Concentrator. And so how does it work? Well, handshakes with the SAFF 40, and that you have a common pipe that is feeding the secondary fractionate into the Hyper-Concentrator's influent tank. There's then 5 individual vessels which are inside the system, and they're designed to accept the secondary waste. They work in a batch-based function, and they're typically able to reduce that secondary waste by somewhere between 20 and 200 times. Now the upshot of that is that the Hyper-Concentrator is able to take waste from anywhere between 2 and 4 SAFs, and then it's able to reduce it down into typically single digits or low tens of gallons per day of this PFAS Hyper-Concentrate. The upside for that is that destruction technologies, high energy, high cost, don't have to treat such large volumes of waste. Instead, we're able to give them a very small package of concentrated waste for destruction. Getting this concentration step right is a really integral part to the PFAS treatment train. It's something we've been focusing a lot on. As I say, it's quite a new development for us, and we're looking forward to sharing the lessons and the challenges of getting this process right with you over the coming months and years ahead. But we just wanted to give you an initial introduction. So if you've got any inquiries about it, or you want to find out more about it, by all means, get in touch.
So Pete, the addition of the SAFF Hyper-Concentrator to the PFAS remediation train is an enhancement of the destruction capability.
It's an enhancement of the whole PFAS treatment train, really, Dave. So the thing I guess I wanted to point out to start with is the Hyper-Concentrator is not going to be used in every application. When you're treating nice low complexity waters, like typically groundwaters or surface waters, runoff waters, then the onboard tertiary fractionation capabilities of the SAFF 40s are going to be quite adequate. But the point is, in more complex waters, and we're seeing a lot of these, then the volume of secondary waste produced can back up and slow down the throughput. So, so having the separate Hyper-Concentrator to take the secondary waste from multiple SAFF systems to allow those SAFF systems to be optimized for maximum throughput, while also managing the waste equation on the side through the hyper-concentrator is how we've engineered and built this arrangement.
No worries. So you mentioned just now that you can use the SAFF Hyper-Concentrator for multiple units. Have we tried that yet?
Well, on the shot you've got on screen, so this is the Shoalhaven Council site. So this is an Australian site in New South Wales where we're treating a landfill leachate. That's a pond in the foreground from a big landfill you can see behind. So we've had a SAFF system down there processing that leachate water for about a year, and we've been building up stocks of secondary as we trial it. So the guys at Shoalhaven were good enough to let us handshake, bring the hyper-concentrator down onto site. It's connected through so that the systems basically speak to each other, so that there is a when our tank 4, which is our secondary concentrate tank, reaches a critical level, it directs that water into the influent tank of the hyper-concentrator, and it goes through its process through one of those 5 tertiary fractionation units to conduct the tertiary stage. So we did it there for a number of weeks as a trial, and now we've just sent it across to Grand Rapids in Michigan to the Crystal Clean site up there, and that site is kind of like our poster child site at the moment. It's got a very cool double-decker SAFF arrangement. So those 2 SAFF 40s, each of those is processing between 20 and 50,000 gallons a day of PFAS impacted leachate, and also large volumes of event water from different sites as it comes in from all over the country really at the moment. So what I'm up there in a week or so's time, just after the Battelle conference, we're going to put in a 3rd SAFF 40 unit, and then we're going to put the hyper-concentrator on the bottom. So it'll be 2 by 2, 3 SAFs and 1 hyper-concentrator. And the secondary concentrate from each of those 3 SAFs will feed into the hyper-concentrator unit, and we should see those reduction factors. Across those 3 units, we'd expect to produce somewhere between 5 and 15 gallons a day of hyper-concentrate, which we can then hand over to the chosen destruction partners. The Crystal Clean guys have been working with a number of destruction techs to destroy that, pretty hardcore waste that comes out of that. It's in the tens of thousands of times more concentrated than the influent, so it needs to be managed carefully. And so they hand that over to the hyper-concentrator that does its work, and then on to the destruction tech. And ultimately, what we're trying to create is these closed loops, like particularly with circular guidelines having come in, it's going to be complexities around transporting PFAS impacted waste, particularly in high concentrations. So our ideal scenarios involve us integrating a destruction cell into the hyper-concentrator technology itself, so that the whole operation is conducted autonomously, automatically within that system. So ultimately the defluorination and mineralization occurs within the system and on site. And what's more is the water element, bearing in mind that even these hyper-concentrates are 99% water, but the treated water element is then circulated back to the beginning of the SAFF. It's dropped back into those huge tanks you can see behind you. And those units are that tiny volume of water, 1 20,000ths, 30,000ths of the overall volume, so it has no impact on through flow, is returned to the beginning of the journey, just in case any stray molecules or partially defluorinated molecules are picked up on the next round through.
Nice. So the take-home message is that the SAFF Hyper-Concentrator gives us a commercially viable option for PFAS remediation for our clients.
That's right. I think the market now fully recognises that separation and concentration is a necessary first step to enrich waste that destruction cell developers are seeking to destroy. And therefore, the typical destruction cell throughput rates of 1 to 2 gallons per minute become a multiple on top of the SAFF waste enrichment factor, and therefore creating that economic advantage compared to just trying to destroy unconcentrated feed water. So as Pete keeps telling me all the time, the goal is to remove and destroy PFAS, not massive volumes of water. And this is why we're working so hard to put SAFF to work with most of the destruction cell providers globally, so we can confirm the compatibility of SAF's concentrates or hyper-concentrates as a wastewater feed material.
Excellent, excellent. So, Pete, with high concentration waters, would you feed those into the SAFF system, or would you feed them directly into the hyper-concentrator?
It's a bit of an either-or scenario, really, Dave. I mean, in some very high concentrate waters, like an AFFF foam material that you're just trying to reduce it's already very high concentration. You might feed it straight into the hyper-concentrator, into the influent tank for the hyper-concentrator, and just do one more reduction step. If in certain waters you might want to put it into the secondary stage and just do two reduction steps, or in some instances you might want to just put it to the front end and run it right through primary, secondary and tertiary. But ultimately we can sort of advise you based on the type of waters you're receiving, and it's not just about the PFAS concentration, because some heavily PFAS impacted waters simply don't foam, so it's not just a sort of a one size fits all. But understanding the water chemistry, we're able to then advise where to best introduce it into the system for particular types of water, and really ultimately trying to give the client the best value. So the less processing you have to do, the cheaper it's going to be, the better value you're going to get. But also we want to give the client the least volume of waste we can, so that they don't have these complex problems around destruction volumes.
Right. So, and in terms of our hyper-concentrator, how are we looking after the safety of our people?
We're doing a huge amount of work in the engineering side around safety, and you have to, right? Like these are hyper concentrates that are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of times more concentrated than the influent waters. So you have to give them the respect that they deserve. So in the hyper-concentrator design, you can see there in the image on the screen, so we've got 5 hyper-concentrators housed in that system. Each of those hyper-concentrators has its own, is completely sealed, like they're watertight, they're certainly airtight. They only have a single vent exit point, and that the venting from each of those individual 5 units runs through carbon filters. We have a standard small carbon filter on the systems. You can see there the 5 filters correspond to the 5 units. Of course, we can upscale those to whatever the calculations based on airflow and contamination level require. Here's a good example at one of the sites where the guys have just applied a precautionary principle to air treatment. So the discharge from those SAFF units goes initially through 4 55-gallon drums in a lead lag arrangement, and then they're then manifolded to a further 4 55-gallon drums. It's a huge amount of treatment capacity on that, and then any condensate flows into the holding tank at the base, where it's returned to our concentrate tank in the SAFF for reprocessing. So, you know, that air treatment element's very important. If we go back to the hyper-concentrator, you'll see each of the vessels is contained within a cubicle. So each one of those cubicles is also sealed. They're also independently vented. And then the container itself is independently vented. And so our protocols are, as soon as you enter the system and open a cubicle, you have to don an organic respiratory protection mask, just as a precautionary approach. And then we're also doing quite a lot of testing just to understand the levels of contamination from aerosolization that might be occurring, to make sure that we're not putting any of our workers or operators or indeed members of the public in any danger.
Thanks. And we've got a question from Kerry. What electrical service, e.g. 3-phase, 460 volt, whatever amps, and other consumables are needed to operate the SAFF 40 system and the hyper-concentrator?
So the systems run on 3-phase power, so 415 to 460 volt, depending on your territory. They'll plug into whatever envelope of 3-phase power you've got. They're typically a 60 amp system for a SAFF 40. Slightly lower 32 amp system will work on the SAFF Hyper-Concentrator. So yeah, that's the power requirements per system.
Thanks, mate. No worries. Okay, so
I might actually add something to that is across that billion litres we've treated, Kerry, the consumption of power per cubic metre, about every 265 gallons treated, is about 0.7 of a kilowatt. So you can run some calcs backwards for that to see that actually for a system that doesn't use consumables, results in almost no waste, is designed to operate autonomously through remote telemetry without a full-time operator presence. The power is one of the consumables, and it's actually very low at 0.7 kilowatts. It's a matter of dollars a day, so tens of dollars a day maybe.
It's basically a computer-controlled plumbing system, just with pumps and blowers.
Pipes and valves and blowers there. It's very it's actually agricultural by design. We've tried to make it as simplistic and low burden as we can. So.
Thanks. So now we're going to move on to the next part of the webinar, where we talk about SAFF and short chain contaminants. So we all know that those PFAS short chain contaminants are at less than or equal to C6, and they're traditionally quite difficult to remove. There's also a perception out there that SAFF has trouble with those, but that's a myth, isn't it, Dave?
It is, and I think we're starting to break that myth now that we've been treating both long chain and short chain using a variety of levers that we apply to remove long and short chain PFAS from SAFF. I guess, like as you mentioned, short chain PFAS is traditionally a bit more difficult because they're more soluble in water, and they have less uptake to any media, including a gas, liquid, or an air-water interface. As we'll talk about in a moment, we've been applying a number of these new levers to get them out, the short chains out.
So Dave, what are those ways that we're using to control those?
So I guess if we start with the traditional methods, which comprise polishing media that we would put after SAFF, these are GAC and anion exchange resins that have a bit of a tighter cross linkage to catch those small short chain molecules. They always come with issues, and the issues are that we end up with exhausted media. We need to dispose of them.
Replacement.
All of those. So it's not our preferred approach. So we've been looking at alternative methodologies with our partners, Alonia in the US, who have come up with a foam booster amendment that we can microdose into the SAFF process using an onboard SAFF dosing system. We'll talk about that one in a moment as well. And then the third approach, which we also have our eye on and working with our partners, is more to do with the management of air bubbles, the size of the aeration, the types of aeration applicators with or without boosters, and going all the way down to the leading edge of research, which is looking at colloidal gas aphrons.
Okay, Dave. So in terms of those traditional methods you mentioned first, can you talk to us about how EPOC Enviro's use sorption media?
It's our very first SAFF prototype that we put in the field was here in Australia at the Yoki Army Aviation Centre in Queensland. So post SAFF, it had an integrated GAC guard column to protect a resin treatment train, which comprised a stage 1 lead lag long chain resin system, followed by a lead lag short chain resin system. And we put those in just as a safety net in case at the time, like we were pretty certain SAFF would do the job for the 3 long chain compounds under criteria here in Australia.
But we're under contract, so we had to make sure.
Yeah. Obviously, we wanted to be paid, so we put them in. And through many years of sampling and testing, we proved that it wasn't required, even though it was there as a backup. But it remains there today, 5 years later, as a legacy, and it's operated really well. And it's been removing short chains, even though we don't need to remove them under contract or under our regulatory obligations.
It's worth saying on that site, we haven't had any exceedances from SAFF for those criteria compounds, and that GAC and resin that's there is still the original GAC and resin and remains unexhausted with no breakthroughs. So SAF's been doing all of the work. So, it's a good safety net.
Yeah.
And I'm glad we put it in. Yeah. That luckily hasn't been required.
And you can see from that image, our first prototype, the SAFF was using like off the shelf plumbing
Yeah,
catalog bits and pieces, whereas
yeah.
today it's much more engineered and
yeah. There's
sophisticated.
a lot of lessons applied, but the same principles are still there all these years
So Dave, let's talk non-toxic boosters. So non-toxic boosters is big news in the short chain PFAS world. So can you share with us how that optional dosing works?
Yeah, so all SAFF containers now come with a standard onboard integrated dosing system. And you can see up there in the top right-hand corner, the orange diaphragm pump sitting on top of a 200 litre or 55 gallon booster tank that gives an average capacity of 1 to 2 gallons per day supply of the surfactant.
It's about a month's worth, isn't it?
Yeah,
Tank.
yeah. The tank includes an integrated stirrer, the pumps delivering milliliter accurate dosing amounts or volume that can go into primary fractionation or secondary fractionation. We've also demonstrated that we remove the complete booster recovery out of the treated water that reports into the foamate, which the regulators are quite interested in. And most importantly, we've made the system so that the practitioner or the operator of the SAFF, they can program any dosing volume at any time they want in the process. So they have control to manage site-specific water chemistries to remove the short chains.
Yeah, I guess one of our good learnings has just been that you can add these additions and boosters and surfactants and solvents and so on, but part of the art of it is when to put them in and where to put them in and for how long to put them in. And so you can waste a lot of material injecting at the wrong time in the process and in the wrong concentration. So I think part of the value chain that we've been able to gain through, I think we've now done 7 onto our 8th booster trial, is just to understand what is going to optimize this booster process.
Yeah, and especially microdosing a booster into primary fractionation where we're conducting bubble fractionation. So we're minimizing the amount of booster to remove short chains rather than trying to dose a lot of booster in there to create a foam.
Yeah.
Whereas in bubble fractionation, we're trying to avoid creating a foam.
So just to touch on bubble fractionation, so do you want to just explain that to the guys, some of the different modes?
Yeah, so SAFF has been engineered to operate in foam fractionation mode, where the concept or the objective is to enrich the waste or dewater the waste, whereas bubble fractionation, it's designed to strip the maximum amount of PFAS target compounds out where it doesn't create a foam. So we're spilling over lots of bubbly liquid, and the air-water interface on each swarming rising bubble that spills over a weir, it's stripping to the maximum capacity of the system. But the side effect of that is that it spills a lot of wastewater, and that's why our process then has a secondary and a tertiary fractionation process that operates in foam fractionation mode to dewater the waste.
It's also probably worth throwing in here, Dave, too, that there's a third mode of operation, which is effectively aerosol fractionation. And so one of the really fascinating learnings from the project in Minnesota for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency was we can actually not overflow any liquid over the primary weirs, and you'll still get huge volumes of PFAS removal through aerosolization alone. And so that it opens up a whole can of worms. So we last webinar we lost about 10 minutes on it, so I've got to just try and keep it short. But effectively, the message is there's different fractionation modes depending on whether you've got high foaming waters, mid foaming waters, non-foaming waters. You can adjust the system to accommodate the different water types.
Yeah, and I guess that aerosol fractionation mode, you might be thinking, how does that occur? Well, it's when micro or nano bubbles swarm up and stratify, reach the surface, and they burst at the surface and form aerosol fragments. If that happens and you've got that type of site water and you're using these micro nano bubble aerators in a system, you need to capture that aerosol and condense it back to a liquid.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of the keeping these systems sealed and appropriately vented is a really important part of the design. This is the takeaway message. All right.
Thank you. So something I imagine the audience wants more information on. It talks about non-toxic boosters. Are they actually safe?
Yeah, mate, they are. I mean, so we started our journey of additives with CTAB, which is a brominated surfactant material. You know, it's an aquatic toxin, so it wasn't ideal. It was just off the shelf at the time, and we were able to kick off with it. We were working with the guys from CDM Smith's Bellevue Laboratory, Zoom and Charles, and so we applied that, and it worked, and it sort of proved the point that we could enhance short chain uptake through these additives. But as we've gone along that journey, we've worked with the guys at Alonia, and the beauty of Alonia is they're a bioengineering, a biotransformation company, and so Alonia were fantastic at trying to target non-toxic, biologically derived additives that we could incorporate into the system that would be food grade safe. So we've put a lot of work into the non-toxic nature of the additives. So I think it's fair to say they're safe, and I think that point is an important point is that all of the boosters that are added are transitioned into the foam. So they don't form part of the treated water. They're non-detect in the treated water. All of the booster transitions to the foam, and then that foam is concentrated again, and ultimately makes its way through to the destruction cell where it's broken down. So so it's not discharging with the treated water.
Thank you. Thanks. So, in addition to the traditional GAC and resin and non-toxic boosters, we've got a couple of other tricks up our sleeve. So,
yeah,
talk to us about bubble sizes.
Yeah, mate. So, I mean, for years, since really the journey first began in 2016, we've been fascinated by different types of bubbles. And as if you ever are bored enough to really dive into the art and science of bubbles, there's a lot of different ways to make bubbles, a lot of different configurations and sizes. And so, when we first began and we discovered, Dave used put his aeration diffuser line into a measuring beaker of PFAS impacted water, and we got foam coming out. We've been wondering what is the right bubble size. So we started with very fine bubbles. We actually brought in a dissolved air flotation, a DAF system. And we realized pretty quickly that DAF's not the answer, because the problem with DAF is it probably does get adherence of PFAS molecules to those really nano bubble size bubbles in solution, but they take so long to come out of solution, it's just never going to be practical in the real world to use a DAF-based approach to treat PFAS impacted waters, because your throughput rates are going to be so slow. So, we went up a few bubble sizes. At the time, the criteria compounds were largely C6 and above, so we were able to get them with quite coarse air bubbles, 0.5 of a millimeter and above. So we didn't worry too much about the bubble size for a few years there as we were evolving the SAFF. But over the last year or so, we've actually gone back to the drawing board in our R&D around bubble injections. So using pinwheel injectors and multi-barrel venturis and different techniques to create an array of different bubble sizes. What we find is you can't use fine bubbles alone, but you can use pulse injection at critical stages, just like we microdose the SAFF at critical stages. We can also microdose fine bubbles into solution to enhance uptake. And one of for us as a company focused on the principles of green chemistry and ultimately trying to use air to resolve the PFAS problem, then exploring this element of nanobubble, microbubble dosing is really a critical part of the success of foam fractionation, I think, in the long run, both with and without boosters, to strip the full family of PFAS out of solution. And then we're also doing quite a lot of so Charles Newell and also the guys more recently from the University of Adelaide are doing some interesting work around colloidal gas aphrons and using that, which effectively creates extremely fine air bubbles coated in a surfactant. And what that does is it flips the charge on the air bubble that then makes it amenable to target the head chemistry of the PFAS molecule rather than the tail chemistry, which we would target. So we've also been doing some research into that area just to try and find out what is the most sustainable way that we can strip this PFAS from solution.
Nice. Okay. Thanks, Pete. I think we've also got some consolidated data and some case studies that we can share.
We do. So yeah, I've got what I wanted to do is just take the viewers through a couple of case studies without boosters, and then I wanted to just do a little bit of exploration into with boosters. So first of all, just wanted to credit Alonia with those guys have been doing some great work on booster additives with the bench scale units and also out in the field. As have Envitech over in Europe been doing some great work. So we're now getting a really good body of data across multiple sites and waters on how this booster will work. But in this instance, I just want to take you up to a site in Massachusetts, which is where we, at the time, we were dealing with the state MCLs of 20 ppt on the 6 compounds you can see there. And so we brought up a SAFF 20 unit to site. The good news is, so the blue lines are the influent level and the dark blue lines below the light blue lines are the effluent level. As you can see, there's no dark blue lines. In actual fact, what we did on that site was strip all of those compounds down to non-detect. So that was quite a complex, it was a what do you guys call it, an ash leachate facility or landfill facility. So we had lots of complex chemistries that we were trying to look at, but that system worked incredibly well. We got complete removal of those compounds, and then we got concentration factors to secondary, not to tertiary, but to secondary of about 750 times. So if you apply the tertiary stage that we have built into the SAFs, but also is now in the hyper-concentrators, then you're up around that 15,000 to 100,000 times reduction. So basically, you're producing a gallon or two a day out of these systems, even in complex leachate waters. And then the next example is a site in Minnesota, which I touched on earlier, but Minnesota Pollution Control Authority have been wonderful kind of pioneers in this space of looking at groundwater and surface water treatment in one of their contaminated catchments at St. Paul there. Quite a high profile site where we've got a SAFF on at Tablin Park. And so we were exploring how we could deal with this water. Now, this water is super interesting because it does not foam one bit, not one bubble, not one piece of foam. Doesn't matter how high the concentration is, that puppy is not going to foam at all. So I was doing the commissioning on that project and I was slightly terrified because I'm like, oh, it doesn't foam at all. Like, how are we going to deal with this? So Dave and Tony back in the lab had been doing some work with non-foaming waters and this bubble fractionation principle that we were applying. So we tested that on site, and fortunately to good effect, and we were able with this non-foaming water to still get complete removal of the C6 chemistries and above. So you can see there the PFOA, the PFOS, PFNA and PFHXS all down to non-detect. So no boosters in this. This is just using foam fractionation alone. And the one that we didn't get, which we didn't expect to get, was the PFBS, which fortunately on that site was in low levels in the influent anyway, but marginal removal of PFBS, 5 or 10%. So it's more just background noise. So 97% removal overall across those compounds, which was great, and then allowed us to meet the state MCL requirements for discharge. But the concentration factors on this water, as I say, clean waters are so good. We were getting 42,000 times concentration at secondary. So you imagine you start applying tertiary to that, you're literally moving into the millions of times, which aligns with our experience at Oki with groundwater, where we're getting 3.4 million times concentration. In this instance, we'd probably expect to get at least that high. So very good performance just using SAFF alone. And so then the MCLs come out. We see them coming a year ago. We see PFBS. We see these 0.4, 4 picograms, where we're like, oh my goodness, I don't even know how you test for that, let alone remove it. So we started to really switch our focus to some of the short chains, which we knew we were going to struggle with traditional foam fractionation. So what you see here is a range of PFAS molecules that are quite typical in most PFAS signatures along the bottom axis. And then you'll see the red box, and then to the right of the red box are the ones that we would effectively remove with SAFF only. So you can see adjacent to each molecule, there's effectively 3 columns: the influent, the SAFF only result, and the result with the SAFF booster. And so what we found is the long chains were no problem with SAFF only. We were getting that out. And then as you move into within the red box, we're starting to look at some of the C6 carboxylates, you know, the C5s, the C4s, the butanoics, and we were starting to struggle to get those out with SAFF alone. So with the booster additive, in very tiny microdoses, we were able to see some amazing results. And when these results first started flowing in, we were very excited for obvious reasons. So PFBS, which is one of the criteria compounds under the US federal MCLs, we're seeing removal down to non-detect. The hexanoic sulfonates, the hexanoic acids, we were also seeing removal down. I think that was sort of 1 ppt. The pentasulfonates down to non-detect. So, you know, really brilliant results. And what that meant is that against the MCLs, you know, we now have a bit of a benchmark on how SAFF, with or without boosters, is going to perform against these new MCLs. So,
thanks, Pete. So really fantastic information around short chains and short chain removal. So now we're going to move on to the next section of our webinar. So recently the US EPA made a long-awaited announcement, as most of you in the call will know, around the maximum contaminant levels and their application for drinking water. So Pete, Intel.
Yeah. Just before I go, I just circled, if people want to know a little bit more about short chain removal performance, both Alonia and Envitech have done some excellent webinars lately where they go through multiple sites and multiple performance data. So Kent and Andrew and Rob and Jason from Alonia present some really compelling material, and then similarly Helena and I think Rob from Envitech have got some great data on that as well, so I'd encourage you to look at their websites. So the MCLs, so there's been a flurry. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I'm exhausted by the amount of material that's been coming through since the 10th of April on the MCLs, so we're all hopefully fairly familiar with them. I'll very briefly touch on them and then look at them in the context of SAFF. So six compounds: PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, PFHXS, Gen X, and PFBS. So hard limits on PFOA and PFOS at 4 parts per trillion, 10 parts per trillion on PFNA, PFHXS, and Gen X. And then this hazard index approach to 2 or more of those lower 4 compounds of PFNA, PFHXS, PFBS, but at 2000 ppt, important to remember that, and then Gen X. So it's relatively forgiving with regards to the PFBS. So at a lot of sites, you just won't get it that high. I'm sure there are sites where it's over that, but we were starting to look there. Okay, we've got these 6 compounds. We're likely to get 9 under RCRA, but let's have a look for now with what we've got in front of us, which is the MCLs. And of course, anyone who's been in the remediation game for a while, they'll understand that the water quality limits that are set for contaminants are typically the target criteria for remediators. I mean, it's as regards to drinking water, of course, but you're generally getting a bead on where the regulators are heading in terms of the targets we've got to reach in leachates, in event waters, in sewage discharges, in all these kind of areas. So, you know, as I said, we've treated about 265 million gallons now, and so we've probably treated 50 different types of water at 30 different sites. I mean, it's a lot of learnings, a lot of data, and what we are absolutely confident in is that we will remove PFOS, PFOA, PFNA, and PFHXS down to 1 ppt or thereabouts. So we're very confident we'll get those materials down under the MCLs. They are very amenable to foam fractionation. They're very surface active. Their absorption isotherms are very favourable, even in the least favourable conditions. We're still recovering those, Minnesota being a good example. you can see we're getting those materials out. So with a very high level of confidence, I say that those materials are not going to pose a problem to SAFF. PFBS, as I say, we've got 7 studies now. Those studies are indicating the worst of them. We got 50% removal on some of the earlier studies. The latest studies we're seeing, we're getting the dosing regime right, when to put it in, where to put it in into the SAFF vessel itself, how often to put it in, how often to microdose over the process. And when we get that right, we're seeing complete removal of PFBS down to non-detect. So I'd say, I wouldn't say it's extremely high, but I'd say I've got a very high level of confidence that PFBS won't be a problem. And then as we look at the Gen X, the dimer acid, you've got this interesting feature of an oxygen molecule in the center of the molecule. So while there are a number of carbon molecules, which would typically mean we'd have a positive absorption coefficient for fractionation, it actually behaves more like a short chain molecule in terms of absorbance to the air-water interface. And so I've only got very limited data sets because it's hard to come across this in most PFAS signatures on sites. But the early indications from a couple of tests we've done are we'll get a positive removal. It should be north of 90%. So we've got more research planned in that Gen X space. But again, it's with I would say a medium level of confidence at the moment that I say we'll be able to deal with that as well. So over that suite of 6 materials, SAFF or SAFF with boosters is going to be able to resolve a lot of clients' problems on sites.
No worries. Thanks. So we're bang on 60 minutes.
Really already.
So
Sorry, I've got to stop talking.
That's okay. So we've concentrated on concentrating. We've given you an update on short chain removals, and we've also talked about the US EPA maximum contaminant limits. Thank you. This is the end of the formal part of the webinar. We will move on to the Q&A shortly. Before we do that, though, I'd like to point out that one of our distribution partners, Alonia, is attending the Battelle 2024 Chlorinated Conference in Denver, Colorado, 2nd to 6th of June this year on stand 228. Pete will also be there. So if you're down that way, drop in and say good day. He'd be very happy to talk. You can also send a question directly to both Pete and Dave on the email addresses that you see up on the screen anytime, and they'll be only too happy to engage with you and answer your questions. And lastly, if we could ask you to find us on LinkedIn and follow us and keep a watch out for the next webinar. Thanks, Pete. Thanks, Dave. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day over there. Talk to you soon.